Great. I'm really excited to have Munira Khayyat with us, who I have known for decades from Beirut, from our mutual time in Beirut.
And Colombia.
Oh, actually, that's true. Oh my God, it is even further back.
Yeah.
And Munira is a brilliant anthropologist who does really, really fabulous works. And kind of like the fairy tales, one of a trio of sisters who are the absent co-authors of the project that she's going to be talking about today. Munira is going to speak a little bit about, actually, although even though this project itself is autobiographical, she is going to talk a little bit about how the trajectory of moving from the sort of the research project that she had before to the current project, which is much more autobiographical, and how that trajectory came about. And also, I've asked her to speak a little bit about what it was like to work with her sisters. So, Munira, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, dear Lale. It's really such an honor always to be in proximity to you, and thank you for collecting this brilliant audience. Thank you to everyone who's here today. My name is Munira Khayyat, and I teach anthropology at NYU Abu Dhabi. I work on landscapes of war, oil, love, empire. Those are kind of like the writ large sort of frames of the things that I look at. And my first book, which I'm going to talk about briefly because Lale asked me to, is entitled A Landscape of War, Ecologies of Resistance and Survival in South Lebanon. Just a sec. Okay, I got it. It was published in 2022 by the University of California Press. My first project. Oh wait, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. Okay, that's a title. That's the cover page of my book. I look at war as it is lived as an environment, and I insist on war from the South, and I source the theory of war in my work from the places in which it's lived. For me, war is not an event, it's an environment, which is not to say that I'm, normalizing it or saying that war is something that we should accept. But as an anthropologist and somebody who actually begins with the lived, with the experienced, with the ethnographic, one cannot grasp war as something that happens in exotic elsewheres, that blips into our consciousness, at moments when other people are dying in exotic far-off lands, right? So I did my field work in South Lebanon. I'm Lebanese, or I'm half Lebanese, as you will find out soon. And I grew up in Lebanon during war. So for me, growing up, war was the environment of living. I did my research in South Lebanon, which has been on a fault line of war since 1948. So there, people are mostly villagers and farmers. They live off the land, which is also a battlescape or a battlefield. So how do people go about this? That's my first big research and the first book that I published. And my second project that I'm going to be sharing with you today is an ongoing project with my sisters, and it's provisionally entitled Heart of Black Gold, and it relates. It relates to my first project in terms of myself as a sort of a positioned researcher in the world that looks at history writ large from a very intimate corner, right? So this is where the projects intersect. I've always been I've always felt myself to be kind of on the receiving end of grand history, but I always wanted to be able to sort of speak it differently, because when it's lived, it's very different. So it's those gray zones of war, of empire, that are lived and that are obscured, right, by the very hegemonic narratives that come to dominate them. So often the narratives of nation states and corporations, and largely men, right? So this is where the projects sort of relate to one another. Our mother is Arabian. She She comes from her family comes from Medina. She grew up in Aramco, and this is what I'm going to be sharing about today. So it's an ongoing project entitled Heart of Black Gold that I'm collaborating on with a scholar of literature and a visual artist, Munira Khayyat and Munira Khayyat, who also happen to be my sisters, and that's us in this picture here, slightly younger than at the current moment. We began this project about 5 years ago to think about our place in the violent histories that have made our worlds. Drawing on the frames and approaches of literature, anthropology, and photography, our sisterly, which is to say absolutely feminist project, traces genealogical threads that knit together grand narratives, which is to say hegemonic patriarchal narratives. Across our sisterly collaboration, we shed light upon small and often silent stories, attending to their sutures, seams, cross-hatchings, embroideries, pocket knots, and frayings, with an all-encompassing, extractive, male-dominated and male-narrated landscapes of power. This interdisciplinary yet familiar project seeks to think multimodally and transgressively about the relationship of the grand to the small, the political and the personal, the intimate and imperial. It fleshes out the complex hearts of empire, corporations, nation states, and by hearts we mean the domestic, often ambiguous and mostly obscured and elided life world of corporations, nation states, and empire. We contend, as granddaughters of empire, that these hearts are not simply hearts of darkness. They cannot be grasped in simple or stark terms. For those who inhabit them, they are gray zones where both lightness and darkness combine. This sisterly project grew out of Brownies and Kalashnikovs, a Saudi woman's memoir of American Arabia and wartime Beirut that was published in 2009, written by our mother, Fadia Basrawi, an Arabian Aramco, who collected stories and photographs from her birth family's life at the simultaneous edge and heart of empire. The memoir visibilized to us a hidden world, speaking into a silence that we felt but we did not know. Our project gained tangibility when we inherited a large part of the astonishing archive accumulated by our maternal grandfather, Fahmi Basrawi, who, child of several empires, as we are all, was among the first Arabian employees of Aramco, the Arab-American oil company in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Aramco is one of the most valuable companies in the fossil fuel-dependent capitalist world and the source of America's special relationship with Saudi Arabia, our mother's homeland, and thus to us, her daughters, who remain caught in patriarchal national structures. So by patrilineal and hence national descent, we are Lebanese. Arabia, and by Arabia, I mean Aramco, a place of US empire, is a motherland, a hidden heartland. Our mother's memoir brought into view our mother's silent story as a child of American empire to us, her children, most of which had been exuberantly lived, but completely obscured in our growing up years in Lebanon during the war, where American empire appeared as a different, a much less benevolent beast. The unsettling recognition of the shards of the imperial lodged deep in the viscera of the intimate of us can only be thought of as ambiguous and can only be grasped as both imperial and intimate. How do we understand this? What can we call this lived and embodied space analytically? How do we recognize it, embrace it, theorize it, center it in the stories we tell? This is a strange yet familial space that this work endeavors to illuminate and hold by way of hidden archives that powerfully inventory and thence narrate the intimate traces of history as lived. Centering such archives brings into view subjugated knowledges, elided subjectivities, forgotten times, hidden spaces, unexpected affects, stories untold, animating large swathes of history writ small. This is our mother in the picture as a Aramco Girl Scout. In 2018, my sisters and I published a preliminary article on this collaborative work entitled Pieces of Us, the Intimate as Imperial Archive. And sorry, in 2019. And we are currently researching, sorry, 2018. And we're currently researching and crafting an expanded work that sheds new light on a relatively unaccounted for world that exists in this particular overseas pocket of US empire, a world made by oil. It's a startling, all but hidden space of empire tucked in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We access and understand it as an intimate space, familial and familiar, genealogical. Not only is this project challenging because I'm working on it with my sisters, but it is significant and subversive for the gendered and generational handling of the intimate and candid photographic archive of our grandfather that contrapuntally disrupts the jealously guarded narratives policed by patriarchy, powerful states, and transnational corporations. This topic is wonderfully handled, for example, by Rosie Bashir in her book Archive Wars, The Politics of History in Saudi Arabia. My sisters and I attempt to parse the complexity, contradiction, and continuity of this writing, this naming, this placing, this archiving of history within the domain of the close and familial. To do so, we draw on the affective, sensuous, visceral, and intimate, but we also employ our training in anthropology, visual art, and literature. As we sift through the stories, the fragments and silences that occupy, frame, and compound the complex and unruly narratives, we illuminate the place of the personal in the harsh geopolitical game of power as it continues to generate subjects, horizons, landscapes, and life worlds. What we seek to analytically explore and lovingly examine is this searching of empire to the intimate and its manifold manifestations in tangible and intangible strands of being and belonging, and how these strands continue to curl through the spaces of our lives. I'd like to turn to the story as it is told. Fadia, our mother, writes her father's story as he narrated it to her. In Medina, in the Hijaz, near the end of the Second World War, Fahmi Basrawi was an 18-year-old trainee filing police reports in a stuffy office where his father was Director General of Police Investigations. Fadia writes her father's words. One afternoon, I came across an ad for jobs for single Saudi Arab men in an oil company in the Eastern Province. No one knew much about it except that it was run by Americans and that it was the only job outlet in the country. I thought, why not? It can't be any worse than here, so I went to be interviewed by the local recruiter. All the recruiter wanted to know was if I was literate. He placed his hand on my shoulder, looking very relieved, and said, "Okay, Fahmi Basrawi, we're going to hire you as an English teacher." A teacher of English? But I don't know a word of English, I told him, completely baffled. Never mind, he reassured me. We will teach you. And he offered me a salary twice what I was making as police department clerk, $35. The new job outlet my father, meaning this isn't my mother's words, my grandfather, was referring to was, of course, Aramco. Fahmi turned up the next day at Aramco's recruitment office and was taken to a truck stop where Aramco received its supplies from the Jeddah port, and he bought a ride to Dhahran to start his new life. His ride across the desert atop sacks of wheat in the back of a pickup truck was with two others, the driver and an armed Bedouin, to fend off Bedouin robbers. The trip took 13 and a half hot, dusty days with bread and dates for sustenance and water from the oases they passed through. Half the time was spent bouncing atop the sacks of wheat and the other half digging the truck out of the sand. Fadia describes her father's arrival on the early vestiges of Aramco, the lucrative oil fields where the Americans had set up camp. Upon arrival, Fahmi jumped off the truck with immense relief and looked around for his welcoming committee. Sure enough, the staff of the school were there, two men, Vincent James, who would become Fahmi's mentor and the Dhahran school principal, and an Iraqi translator, Wadia Sabbagh, who also filled in as part-time secretary and part-time instructor. Both men were standing outside the main administrative building of Dhahran, known then as American Camp, on what became Main Street, then a wide, unshaded desert road rutted with tire tracks of the heavy-duty desert trucks parked nose to pipe rail outside Aramco's headquarters, the modern-day horses of America's new oil cowboys. This is in all my mother's words. My words. Fadia paints a vivid picture of her father's entry into this new world. The dream he was sold was quickly dashed when he met with its starkly segregated reality. Upon arrival, he encountered the Jim Crow divisions of the camp that would define his relationship to his American employers. As he walked down the road, flanked, this is my mother's words, flanked by two older men in his new living quarters, my father's spirits rose. In his parched, disheveled, and hungry state, he saw a dream come true, a group of neat bungalows with air conditioning units jutting out from each house. Ice water tanks in the communal mess hall completed the dream. As he quickened his steps in their direction, Wadia Sabah put a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. That is American camp, he said. It's for the American employees only. He pointed in another direction farther down the road. Our camp is there, Arab camp. The camp he was motioning to consisted of starkly wooden rows of tents and barastis, wooden pole frame abodes with dirt floors, and woven palm fronds, ceilings, and walls. It was the non-American bachelor housing camp. And two more things, Wadia informed my father, these are my mother's words. You are to address the Americans as sahib, or else a chunk of your paycheck will be subtracted in punishment. The same punishment applies should you drink this ice water. It's only for the Americans. We drink this. And he pointed to a well with brackish water. This image illustrates the infrastructure of a Manichaean world of colonial racist practices and spatial logics that Frantz Fanon describes in The Wretched of the Earth, that also reflected American imperial practices in Arabia. Quote, Ting Fanon, the world divided into compartments. This world cut in two is inhabited by two different species, end of quote. Arab camp actually housed a multilingual workforce and had entrance signs in Arabic, Swahili, Urdu, and Italian. Sabah explained to Fahmy that the Italians who lived with them were remnants of the Italian army, 2,000 of whom were stranded in the shambles of Mussolini's retreat from Eritrea in 1941. The Italian engineering corps were employed immediately to design and build the major administrative buildings for Aramco, and despite being Europeans, could not share quarters with the Americans. Fahmy had not been expecting such blatantly unequal treatment from his new employers, particularly given his urban upper-class background, but this was a situation on America's Arabian oil frontier. Bob Vitalis argues that the U.S. imperial projects, far from being exceptions, should be understood as extensions of the racist, violent, and segregated expansionist projects and labor practices that shaped capitalist industrial modernity in the United States. Moreover, such imperial projects were similar in praxis and logic to French and British racist overseas colonial ventures. In Saudi Arabia, Vitalis writes, quote, American oilmen and managers recreated the world of Jim Crow in Dhahran and in the satellite settlements and pipeline stations across the Al-Hasa province. Norms of separate and unequal rights and privileges structured work and life inside the camps and in the 1940s and 1950s. Regardless of the unexpected circumstances that instantly transformed him from the son of a respected Hijazi family to a faceless rank-and-file imperial laborer, Fahmy threw himself into his work as a teacher at the Aramco Jebel School that had opened in 1944, with a class of 70 students aged 8 to 18. The boys Fahmy taught were future Aramco laborers who flocked from the villages and oases surrounding the new American oil venture in search of employment. Aramco offered new opportunities and encounters to these sons of herdsmen and fishermen, including Ali Naimi, who became Aramco's first Saudi Arabian president, head of OPEC, and Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources. He's the little boy holding the baseball in this picture. Student numbers grew with the demand for a local workforce that swelled with each oil barrel. Aramco hired 6,000 new employees during this period. Fahmy's job was to teach new recruits rudimentary language skills in English before they entered the subaltern workforce as office boys, waiters, houseboys, and refinery workers. Fahmy's main early challenge was to school himself in the art of schooling others in English, managing to, quote, stay 2 or 3 lessons ahead of his class. Fahmy's malleability as an employee, imperial messenger, and interpreter became apparent to his Aramco employers, who recognized him as cut from a different cloth than the local Bedouin world they needed to infiltrate, exploit, and control in order to take the petroleum and minerals that they desired. They groomed Fahmy to interface with the locals to build the human machinery of resource extraction. Later, they used him as an elegant and charming translator of the project to local elites and visiting dignitaries. Our grandfather came to speak the languages of both sides of the imperial divide and was put to work to ease and grease this uneven imperial partnership. Fahmy took many additional assignments as the ever-smiling face of Aramco, including organizing baseball and volleyball teams, launching the company's first taxi service, and teaching English, Arabic, and arithmetic on the pioneering Aramco TV channel, the second Arabic language station to go on the air in the Arab world. He even hosted a quiz show that catapulted him to stardom and made him a heartthrob. He received overflowing bags of fan mail. Fahmy also wore his pleasant television smile on public relation tours of Aramco's oil exhibit, which the corporation designed to inform Saudis about their major natural resource. The exhibit, covering 7,000 square feet, presented a picture of the petroleum industry with Fahmy as native commentator. He became the tactful, informed, and diplomatic expert who dealt with distinguished visitors to Aramco facilities, as depicted in this 1950 photo. Sandwiched between a U.S. Aramco official who urgently whispers into his ear and Crown Prince Saud during his tour of Aramco's industrial training department and refinery, Fahmy is shown to be a smooth mediator of American empire in Arabia. Given his elite background, he could negotiate the racial hierarchy of the Aramco world, rising above the ranks of the laborers he taught and eased into a life of back-breaking toil. Photos from the early years show him as teacher, mentor, and friend to village boys, as well as the companion of white American men and some women with whom he swims on the beach and plays baseball. A few years after establishing himself in Aramco as a desirable employee, Fahmy married our Syrian grandmother, Muzayyan Qutb, a distant relative of Fahmy's mother from Damascus. Our mother, their eldest child, was born on January 24th, 1951, and was soon followed by her sister and brothers. As the infrastructure of oil-based empire and its technologies of extraction and refining proliferated, Fahmy began a lifelong love affair with photography, to which he devoted much of his free time. He went from amateur to professional photographer and archivist for Aramco's public relations department. He often focused his medium format twin lens Rolleicord camera on himself and on his intimates, documenting his life and compiling a careful archive as both an Aramco employee and as a family man. Interspersed with images of blossoming infrastructures and beaten down laborers are pictures of Fahmy's wife and their cherubic children in their efficient and modern Aramco abode. The archive shows both the oil town and Fahmy's family growing together in an imperial tangle. The Basrawi children lined up on their green lawn as new arrivals in Aramco. US-style county fairs they regularly attended as residents of Aramco. Girl and Boy Scout troops they participated in, birthdays and family snapshots, and other scenes of white American suburbia in Arabia. These family images reflect the domesticated dimension of imperial settings. The archive also includes representations of Fahmy's work world, massive oil refineries, dignitaries, dirty and dusty laborers in trucks and on oil rigs, school children, and him as a dapper Aramco TV star. As Fahmy developed his photographic skills, Aramco put him in charge of snapping photographs of the new Bedouin recruits for the company ID cards. This job was a major feat of diplomacy because in some interpretations, Islam forbids reproducing the human figure. It took a fatwa to convince apprehensive Bedouin men to sit in front of a flashing camera, which personified the devil for many. The photographs in Fahmy's archive index not only Fahmy's recognition and consciousness of the historical changes around him, but also his multiple roles in these transformations. He renders an important era of change visually apparent, and to us also effectively apparent. Some of his photographs seem framed to draw the viewer's attention to the wholesome artifice of Aramco's suburban setting in the foreground, in juxtaposition to the dark smudge of smoke from the oil refineries in the distance, visually illuminating the extraordinary entanglements of US corporate colonial domesticity. In 1954, labor strikes across Aramco oil camps demanded humane conditions and better pay for the Arab Aramco employees. While not the first of such strikes, they were the most effective in threatening the productivity and profitability of the oil venture. In the aftermath, Aramco chose our grandfather, Fahmy, as a picture-perfect example of American-Saudi partnership and cooperation. He was among 10 Arab employees out of 9,000 who were selected to inaugurate the highly touted Saudization program, which sought to serve Aramco's economic and representational purposes, to groom loyal and pliant Arabs to staff the company, not quite alongside Americans, but enough to make them appear democratic, benevolent, and non-imperial. Fahmy was promoted to senior staff, and our mother and her siblings were inserted into this showcase space. In 1956, Fahmy's family was among the first 3 Arab families to move into Aramco's American camp, which had been renamed Senior Staff Camp 2 years previously. In accordance with his newly acquired rank, our grandfather and his young family crossed the color line. They were among the first Arabs to move into the prefab spaces of the white American residential camp that was designed to perfectly recreate 1950s and 1960s suburban America. This is where our mother and her siblings grew up, a new kind of unmarked American imperial subject, the only Arabian kids among white Americans in the oil-rich eastern desert of Arabia. Their identity was at once neither and both Arabian and American. Hence, the corporation itself came to bridge the harsh, uncrossable divide. My mother and her siblings became Aramco. Our mother's homeland was a corporate residential camp in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, an incongruous formation that geopolitically represents a growing U.S. oil-based empire and fabricated a white American world beloved by Aramco children. And this was recently documented photographically by Aisha Malik's book, Above the Oil Fields. Our mother and her 3 siblings are imperial subjects, despite historiography that counts the United States as a non-imperial exception. There are millions of such people, given the hundreds of US colonies and military and corporate bases all over the world. Fadia writes evocatively about this world. The Basrawi kids joined the Brownies, Cub Scouts, and Girl and Boy Scouts of America, played baseball, and camped on Half Moon Bay, Aramco's beach. They watched Howdy Doody, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, The Ed Sullivan Show. In the Aramco Desert Disneyland, as Fadia calls it, she writes, women wore shorts and liquor flowed freely. Residents purchased food in the company store, which sold all things American. The children used bikes and roller skates to move through the neighborhoods and hopped on and off the free bus service driven by Shia Saudis, whom they were trained to call Sadiqi, my friend. Cold water fountains were stationed in all the public places of the camp complete with envelope paper cups and salt tablet dispensers to combat the intensive heat. But being Arab American produced tensions, especially at home. Fadia writes, my father was an obedient employee of Aramco who never exposed his anti-American grouses publicly, but allowed his pent-up anger at the daily marginalizing he suffered under his American bosses to explode at our expense in the kingdom of his own home. Our father thought he would effectively halt the Americanization that was steadily taking over our lives. But of course, he was very wrong. Our Arab and our Arabness were fast becoming pointless irritants in our young Aramco lives. Our parents were unable to give us a role model in our Arab world that we could emulate, but we had plenty in our American one. We began to dream and speak exactly as our American peers did. The Basrawis lived a 1950s US suburban lifestyle as reflected in their meals, clothing, home furnishings, cars, and cultural references without having set a foot in the United States. Fadia writes, my siblings and I were Saudi Arabian by virtue of having been born to a Saudi father, and that's where Saudi Arabia stopped in defining us. Without ever stepping foot in the United States of America, we developed into a new breed of the American colonized while living on Saudi Arabian soil. Saudi in name and as American as the Americans and everything else. We called ourselves Aramcons. The siblings even addressed one another by the American mispronunciation of their names. On the surface, Fadia and her siblings came to see themselves as all American, but in their home, as well as among their American peers, teachers and neighbors, it was clear that they were not. Our mother and her siblings recognized their difference. Fadia was the only Arab to graduate with her 1965 Aramco 8th grade class, and the first to do so. The photographer strategically places her at the center of the frame. Our 14-year-old mother appears as one among a crowd of bright young faces dressed in white. Yet she differs in her cultural frame and citizenship, the former subtly marked by the longer skirt she wears in comparison to the other girls in the front row. Other differences ran much deeper. The Basrawis inhabited two worlds in the Hanan that were together yet apart. The edges chafed, producing occasionally violent ruptures where monstrous seams even the children glimpsed. My mother recounts this in detail in her memoir, and we touched upon them in our 2018 article. The ferocious capitalist modernization of Saudi Arabia was due to the development of the oil industry. Abdurrahman Munif's novel, City of Salt, renders the impact of the US oil development and the implantation of a white US imperial community on indigenous people, animals, environments, and political systems in a fictional area widely understood as Saudi Arabia. The danger is woven into the very title. Woe will befall the cities of salt built on fossil fuel extraction in the Arabian desert, where oil will one day run out. Whereas Fadia Basrawi in her memoir traces the emergence of Aramco from her perspective as a daughter and an inquisitive young woman, Munif draws from the salt of the desert dramatist persona who war with royals. Through clashes between men, Munif presents a scathing account of the twin emergence of the Saudi security state and the colonization of Arabia. His account constructs a crude petrofictive universe juxtaposed against the harsh beauty of desert life that works as a passionate cry against what he once called the trilogy of evils afflicting the Arab world, among which oil extraction runs high. Munif's is a communitarian and panoramic view of empire's violent interruption, of the idyllic symbiosis of traditional life with its animals, cosmologies, and practices. Shaped by our experiences, our mother's memoir, and our grandfather's photographic archive, our sisterly intervention, in contrast, focuses on the complex, embodied, affective positionalities and subjectivities forged by such economies and communities over time, generations, and space. We address intimate entanglements and desires and the gendered multi-generational embodied repercussions of oil imperialism. In the prison notebooks, Antonio Gramsci writes, and this is also prominently quoted in Edward Said's Orientalism, quote, "The starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical processes to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. Therefore, it is imperative at the outset to compile such an inventory. This sisterly work is an attempt at such an inventory against the archival grain and against patriarchal, national, imperial structures and infrastructures and hegemonic narratives." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Munira. I think you've shown more pictures in this one than I have ever seen, and they're amazing. And I really want to talk to you afterwards about what your plans are. But I actually do have two questions about this. One is the question of intimacy. Because in some senses, the intimacy that you're talking about is the intimacy within the sort of the family. But in what sense? And is there a larger part of the project which talks about intimacy outside the bounds of Fadia's family? So friends, perhaps other Arab families that lived within the Aramco compound, and also Americans and other nationalities. That's the first question I've got. And then the second question I've got is, how are you guys going to expand the book? And also, if you want a contact for a picture book producer, I'm really happy to introduce you to one that would be very interested in something that bridges the sort of the divide between academic and artistic. So let's talk about that later. But I am curious about the sort of the larger intellectual project of the book.
Thank you so much, Lale. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my work, and thank you for those beautiful questions. The first question is a really, really important one, this question of intimacy. And it's something that I'm rather obsessed with as a methodology of interrogating history writ large. As an anthropologist, we often kind of, position ourselves in the intimacy of life worlds. But also there's I mean, in this project, because it's also like a sisterly project, a familial project, one that is also intuitive in nature, the initial kind of conceiving of it came out of kind of an intuitive reaction, to these images that actually just kind of fell into our lap after the death of our grandfather in a disordered state that we had to then piece together through silence, because our mother did not share. I mean, she shared a lot of her growing up world with us, growing up in Lebanon during the Civil War, but also not enough for us to really understand those worlds. So we entered this world intuitively, and we drew on our intimate sense of having lived in this family and inherited its imperial, intimacies. So it's a method, I would say, of interrogating history that also places it in a very feminist reading of history, because, I mean, standpoint theory and all, but also reading against the grain, but also subaltern history, but also a work that is really informed by literary genres, right? And I mean, one of my sisters, Yasmin, is a scholar of literature, and the other is a visual artist and a photographer. And so they also have their disciplinary capacities to read, but also from an intimate standpoint, right? So intimacy is what unites us. Then we have the methodological sort of approaches of our various but complementary disciplines. And so there's definitely kind of this intimate sort of methodological stance. To ask the other part of the question about beyond the family, absolutely. I mean, this world, this kind of like monstrous world of Aramco, because it is so unique, but also so all-encompassing, both kind of celebrated but hidden, has a whole, I mean, now like generations, right, who have come out of there and are speaking their histories in ways that I don't think have been sufficiently documented. I'm connected to oh, there's one of my sisters. That's great that she just showed up. I invited both of them, but I thought they had better things to do. Nice to see that she's showing up. Maybe she can help answer questions. But to resume what I was just saying, I mean, I'm part of all these online communities of Aramco brats, they call them, but it's mostly kind of the American Aramcons, right? Who are also like deeply shaped by the world they grew up in, that they then left and never returned to, right? So there's a sense of this Aramcon that is like illusory, that it does not exist in any sort of tangible way to people, except in the material remnants of their life there, but also the affective registers that still dominate their worlds. And so I hope in the project as it unfolds, that we can be able to go beyond the family, to draw in other strands of intimacies, right, that can then narrate this picture of Aramco from this imperial and intimate standpoint. And the larger project is going to unfold. I mean, it's an interesting challenge to work with one's siblings. It's an interesting challenge to work across disciplines. So there's a sense of like being actual, sisters, but also being in sister disciplines and trying to figure out how to make the tools of our trade like complement each other. But the beautiful thing is that it really unlocks like so many possibilities about how to then represent this work. And I'm really hoping something that will be profoundly literary and visual, but also ethnographic, that then can be presented in an exhibitionary space, maybe emulating the oil exhibit, that my grandfather would guide the dignitaries through, but in sort of the intimate worlds, the domestic, the affective, the affectionate, that we access. And absolutely, I mean, if you want to hook us up with publishers who work with the photographic volumes, that would be amazing. But right now we're at the research stage. Yeah, still at the research stage. Yeah.
Ask another question, because whenever people talk about intimacy in the context of the imperial, the inevitable reference is Anne Stoller, which I, to be totally honest, find incredibly problematic, because I find that in some ways, in the ways in which it foregrounds intimacy, the imperial power difference actually ends up taking a backseat. So I could see the Stollerish style of approaching intimacy being useful in talking about, I don't know, the Aramcons perhaps, but but in a way it is quite problematic. So what is your, maybe Yasmin can jump in as well, what is your, the three of you, what is your guiding light in thinking about intimacy? What is your touchstone? What is it that you read when you're thinking about intimacy and writing about it?
Yasmin, do you want to answer, or should I go ahead? Okay. I will say that, I mean, the intimacy that I'm really interested in also sort of claiming, and the angle that I really want to foreground, and the grain that I want to read against is that of patriarchy. And it's really interesting that we're like, I mean, you said like mythological three sisters, but often three sisters in mythology are like, evil crones who want to muck things up, right? So I think on that level, that's what we are.
Not in Kurdish and Iranian fairy tales. In Kurdish and Iranian fairy tales, it's usually either 3 or 7 sisters, and they're like really powerful.
Well, I mean, we can be both, right? But I also really seek I seek the intimate angle to be able to sort of grasp, back the thread of history, the thread of narrative from that of the patriarchs. And we are, I mean, legally shaped as citizens, and of course in many other ways, juridical subjects and all that sort of stuff, by the patriline. And often it's the matriline that is subsumed or unspoken, right? But if you trace those matrilines and the narratives that collect around them, and they're often understood in the register of the intimate because they're not necessarily understood at the level of real history. But I want to actually reinvent we want to like reinvent the intimate as a register of reading history. Because honestly, where else is history live, right? So so for me, this is the take, and of course for me, like empire, Anne Stoller is a towering figure in this regard, and I find her work both useful, but also it's narrated from a different, standpoint. The intimate worlds that I want to speak of are the worlds that are lodged within, my viscera, right? And so there's something quite, disemboweling, let's say, sort of gut-wrenching, something unsightly, let's say, but also very intimate, right? That I can then sort of like, pull out of the stories, because those are the ones that are often sort of, hidden by intimacy, meaning occluded or obscured, right?
I have so many other questions, but I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to invite folks to ask any questions that